Yeah, that's definitely something that we've definitely been looking. I'm talking about the looking at the potential automation of, if you've got 1,000 people that are going to have access to this stuff, how do you manage all those people having had the training? You can't do it with spreadsheets. You got to have some sort of system. So, but you need to, before going to the next standard. Sorry.
Say, Mike, can I
Yeah.
just add some vendor perspective on this issue, because it's been a difficult thing for us as we work with different entities. So we took the very role specific. We said, well, we know that each entity will have specific training for them, but on our products and for our first responders in particular, we've got very detailed role specific training back with the test, and gone to the extent of providing an audit trail that the entities can go look up. And it's our hope that program can be integrated with programs for responsible entities, but it's really a very difficult thing between, there's really no norms in terms of what's required in this and in the PRAs, so it gets kind of messy in a hurry.
Yeah, I think the best way to address this, I think what NERC's intent is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're pushing for role-based access controls, what they really want. Because, when you get into the next standard, CIP 4R4, and they start talking access, you got to have the training and the background check before you can get access. And then, what happens when you change cost centers and you go from working in the control center to marketing, you don't need that access. You've got to manage all that. And, the way I've typically seen it done is with spreadsheets. That's not sustainable. So you end up having to look at systems. And there's vendors out there that are providing these solutions. I know IBM has ITIM, and Josh works for Alert Enterprise. They're doing something similar. Computer Associates has something similar. But you're going to have to manage this workflow, and you can't do it manually because it's not sustainable when you get, if you got 10 people, it's fine. But if you start getting to, 1,000 people, 1,500 people on this list, and that's where your lists are going to probably go, you've got to have something like some system to manage that access and ensure that they've had all the training. And, the other thing is that you're required to take that training every year. So you've got to recertify them every year, and then you've got to recertify the background checks every 7 years. I know I've seen the approach to some utilities is that when they issue badges, they just expire them after 7 years from the date that you get it issued to make sure that you don't run into this, violation here, because there are requirements that basically say that, if someone is fired, then their access has got to be removed within 24 hours. If someone quits, it's got to be removed within 7 days. Well, if you're doing that with spreadsheets and you've got all these people involved, you're not going to know if HR fired. So you may find out like 2 weeks after it happened. And I've definitely seen that too. So
yeah, that comment raised a follow-up, if you indulge me, is we took the approach that we do the authorization for a work order that's good for 1 week. Now, how that would be handled at the entity's end, would that person's name stay on the list, or can they take them off after a week? How do you guys do that?
Well, I'm not going to talk about how we do it, but I'll talk about, again, what I've seen. You got to take, and this is a culture change for utilities, believe me. You got to take the hard line, and if anything changes, and you lose that lease, that lease privilege goes away, take their access away. If they want it back or they need it again, then you can reprovision it. Now it gets tricky when you get into the control center and control system environment, because, if you start removing access and they need it, you can potentially affect reliability, right? So you got to be real cautious proceeding there. I think more what I'm talking about is kind of high-level physical access, some logical access, but I would be careful when you start messing around with the dispatchers and the operators and that kind of thing, because you can, you start removing access, you can cause a real serious problem just by the mere fact they can't do what they need to do. So something else to think about. Moving on to CIP 5, basically, what we're basically saying here is that you need to look at the network, the operating system, the database, the application, and try to figure out how to draw an electronic security perimeter around all of that. Because remember, you've got applications. You want to know if you've got applications in your environment that are communicating with applications in other environments, or databases talking to applications, or if your operating system is getting managed by Active Directory and that's sitting in another environment. You want to make sure that you draw that electronic security perimeter properly. That's going back, that's CIP 5. Basically, you want to know what all the egress and ingress points are to your critical cyber asset network. So what's in the middle of both these boxes would be your critical cyber assets from CIP 2. Then you know, basically access points are obviously firewalls or access lists on routers, whatever you prefer to do. You've got to provision access to those, just like again, we're going to get into that when we get into CIP 7. You've also got to be able to log all that stuff. And you want to make sure that you know who has access to what. Again, it goes back to, this is kind of one of these tricky things where, you know, firewalls or access points aren't critical cyber assets, but if they're the perimeter around if they're electronics, if they make up electronic security perimeter, then they have to be treated like critical cyber assets, but then there's some requirements that don't apply to them because it gets real tricky. So you just end up basically just secure them like you do the critical cyber assets, because otherwise, you know, you end up in a, go ahead, Andrew, I'm sorry.
Question about the perimeter there. I'm not on site myself, so I can't verify this firsthand, but I'm interested in the folks who are doing the auditing, the folks who are being audited. The impression I have from reading NERC CIP is that if you come to a site and you say, okay, I need to secure this site, they've got a router now, they don't have a firewall, I'm going to put a firewall in, what kind of rules should I use? The impression I have is that you look at all the traffic going through and say, okay, that's all business critical, and so I open up all the rules for all the existing traffic, and I say, there, I'm secure. Is that permitted by CIP? I know it's not good practice, but is it allowed?
I think by virtue, I can't remember where in the standard this is, but I seem to have read something that implies that you shouldn't put any rules anywhere in the firewall policy. And there should be everything should be point to point. I think that's what you guys were looking for. Point to point rules, basically.
I think that as you look at CIP 5 R2 and you're talking about access points to the electronic security perimeter itself, and it clearly says, you know, use a model that denies by default. I think that speaks exactly what Mike's saying. Does it explicitly say don't do IP any? No, it doesn't say that explicitly, but deny by default means that your first setting should be to not allow anything to come through that firewall. And then you add in beyond that, right, and start allowing certain things. And that's where you get into CIP 7 requirement 2 when you're talking about ports and services and justifying that and then helping to enumerate what needs to be allowed through the firewall based on what's operating on the inside of your environment.
Pretty much. The other things that are required is that you need to maintain your security access log and your security configuration logs. And, you know, I think when we get into CIP 5R4, which is the next one, yeah, it's because of the vulnerability assessment process. And I kind of put this up there so that you can see how confusing that process is. Really, you should just do a vulnerability assessment, not necessarily scan it, but maybe hire a consultant to come in and evaluate the security of the network. Because I'll tell you, you know, going through the standards, and they're trying to, you know, do you have community strings? Do you have this? Do you have that? And they're very specific in what you're supposed to look for. So you end up not knowing what to look for, has been my experience. So really a good vulnerability assessment from a, you know, reputable cybersecurity penetration testing team or something like that would probably be, I would imagine that would pass an audit. Yeah, as long as it hits these four things. But I didn't put that up there so you guys can read it, just how confusing it is and how simplified they tried to make it. Not to knock NERC, I think you guys are doing a wonderful job. And then you've got physical security, which I look at as kind of the same thing as electronic security, except it's physical. You've got to make sure, you know, one of the best ways to illustrate this is you kind of take a circle and draw, you know, put your CCAs in that circle. Then you draw an electronic security perimeter around that. And then you draw a physical security perimeter around that. And understanding, you know, how that works, you know, that's kind of what they're looking for, is they want to know that the critical cyber assets are contained within a logical electronic security perimeter, and that electronic security perimeter is basically protected by a physical security perimeter. It's got the same criteria. It's got the same things that an electronic security perimeter has. It's got access points, which are doors and, you know, gates. It's got monitoring. If you open the door up, you know, it should alarm somebody, and, you know, obviously there's badge readers and things like that to control who has access to the facility. SIP 7, this is R1. Basically, you're supposed to make sure that you test your changes before you make them. This is probably a standard IT practice, but and really in the utility environment, they're usually pretty good at this, I would think, because they don't want anything to happen to affect reliability. So, they basically test everything before they do anything. So this, usually when you get with your engineers and your power people, they usually don't see too much of an issue with this one, even though this is a big deal. Like Josh was talking about before, ports and services, you're supposed to know every port and service running on every critical cyber asset. That doesn't really sound that challenging, but the fact that, most utility companies won't let you scan their SCADA environment, and the fact that you may have over 500 devices in your SCADA environment, that can become a real big problem to keep track of all that stuff, because the vendors, I don't know, who do you work for? Okay, yeah. So my experience is that they don't even know, what the right port, what the restrictive amount of ports and services are that should be running on that's Monarch, right? Oh, okay. I'm thinking about, sorry. They don't even know what ports and services should be running. So this becomes I don't know, maybe you guys want to comment on this. I'm not really sure. How do you comply with something with, I understand the substation's easy. There's like one or two assets. I can scan it offline, figure it out.
Yeah, you scan it in CS. It's just amazing the number of unique
Yeah.
other things that are popping up.
So I'm not sure how you can actually really,
Yeah, this one's really, really hard. I mean, you can, on Windows boxes that are inside there, you can do it yourself using open source tools like SYDI, you can bring that in and do it. But when you get into the applications and the EMS operations, they really depend on rolling ports. And most times the vendors, they'll include that and they'll say, well, we need ports 10,000 to 20,000, and we don't know which ones are ephemeral and when they'll open and when you'll need them. So it's really hard to document them. The applications are the hardest.
You still have the issue obviously you can run Nmap or even Netstat on a computer and find out what ports are open, but then it becomes the challenge of, what are they for, and you can,
well, if they'll let you run Nmap.
if they're well, you can use, if you can get to the host itself, you should be able to basically instantiate what usually like Netstat or something like that. I mean, on Unix or on Windows, you can basically get, most of that. In fact, it's probably better to do it on the host itself rather than running Nmap, because you probably get a more extensive list.
But you can imagine doing that for 500 different assets.
Yeah. Well, and you
or
could,
I think
I'm
in
sure
Jim's case it's 2,200, right?
you could script it, but then, you still have the problem of, you see something running on port 6,977 that you can maybe then figure out what executable or what DLL is associated with, or it's running associated on the Windows side with SVC host or something like that, in which case you really have no idea
That's right.
what it is, and some hex tools and some other things that probably can, but that's where also the vendors are supposed to come in, and that's we may cover it in the procurement section, but ultimately with new products, that should be part of the procurement guidance. That simply say, as part of this requirement, if you're going to sell us this thing, you're going to document all the ports that should be open associated with that application, and then the range of ephemeral ports or whatever, and what they're for. And then as well as all the other NERC CIP requirements that they're relevant to. Obviously, they're not doing background checks on their application itself, but anything that's relevant from a NERC CIP point of view should be in their documentation, whether it's through NDA or through just normal marketing literature. That should be expected requirement, as we're basically asking people to do with smart grid stuff too, is to basically say, tell us how you meet these particular requirements and make them do the work.
We had some vendors we took that question to. So, here's what we need to have so we build compliance, support services, and so forth, so we'll be able to do it. And they said, fine, we'll check into it. They came back to us a couple days later with a bid of $150,000 to do the engineering for us.
Mm-hmm.
And my response back was, you should be able to provide that information as part of your standard technical security requirement assessment. And there just didn't appear to, this is where I'd like to see NERC go forward and grab up all our EMS vendors and so forth and shake them rigorously by the collar and say, look, we need this information across the board. and don't go back trying to stick each individual utility for the cost of engineering that $150,000.
Did you say the vendors wanted money to tell you what the characteristics of their own systems? Is that what you're saying? That's very interesting.
But when you think about the scope of it,
Is that a new line of business for IBM now?
but when you think about the scope of the effort, if you've got, and let's just say like at a typical utility, I've got 500 systems, and I'm going to look at the ports. If I do scan them, and I have done it before, you may figure out that you got 500 ports on every system times 500. You see what I'm saying? And to characterize all those is almost impossible. That's probably why they want to charge that much money.
Well, there's a new book out called Idiots Guide to How to Turn a Firewall into a Chain Link.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'd like to address Jim's question, but I'm not going to do that. But what I was going to talk about, this is an age-old fight. I mean, we were fighting this long before there were even any standards. Back in the late 90s, I remember working and trying to pin down a software vendor and say, okay, what ports do you need open? And they said, all of them, just leave them open. Because all they cared about,
make it work, right?
their job in life was having a product that worked. Yeah, that's the functionality is what everybody, and this is the whole paradigm shift that we have to have. And we still haven't learned, I'm afraid, and it's one of the things that it's almost like, we're doomed to make the same mistakes we were making that got us into the Y2K problem and everything else. We're worried about functionality and the least cost and get the most bells and whistles and market something and get it out there and make people dependent on updates. One thing I wanted to throw out there, though, that I saw, or I actually, Josh could confirm this. I don't know whatever. Did you leave the audit world about when I did? No, you were a little ahead of me, so I'm not sure if you even saw this. But there was an entity that raised a question, or a regional entity that raised a question and said, what about if somebody says it's going to be out of our budget or it's going to be impossible for us to find out what ports have to be open for a particular software product or whatever? What if we put that on a segment all by itself and we disable the ports on a firewall and there's a single spoke, you could call it, or whatever, of this network, and we're not going to do it on, we're going to leave listeners, whatever listeners they have to have open, whatever ephemeral ports, but we're just going to protect it at the firewall level. I particularly argued against that because it's not great security, but yeah, well, but this way the vendors could not come back and say, yeah, you can't do that because you still left the ports open, nothing, because we even saw places, this is now prior to my time at NERC, back when I was at the entity level, and I saw a place where you disable a listener that was never used. You could sit there and sniff the network for weeks, go back with your TCP dump logs and watch it. You never saw this port used, but you disable the listener and then it crashes the system because they're using a dummy listener, for some kind of a bad programming mistake they made or something. So anyway, long story short, again, I was arguing for just pure security from a security standpoint, but they basically made the decision, the way I understand, again, I'm not speaking for NERC in any way on this, but check with your regional entity on this or something, or your auditors. But the way I understand it is they said that was not against the standards. There would not be a PV if you found a way to isolate a system or a group of systems and trapped them, on a hub or a spoke, all by themselves of the network. We're talking about a VLAN that's separated with a separate firewall or firewall port that filters everything but the ports that are needed or you're deeming are needed for business case.
One of the things I used to consult with Gib, and one of the things we did see is that some of these utilities are even looking at deploying application whitelisting within the environment. That seems to be the way that the vendors are trying to go. I think we're looking at Emerson and Foxborough. This is most of our DCS, but
yeah, they were like, Corch Grace is one of them, and Dave Hatchell shows up today. He'll tell you all about McAfee's solid core. Just to follow up on that, the problem in the old days, of course, is that you had turnkey systems where they had everything they needed to run themselves because they were installed in a particular place. Any interaction they had with other systems, usually it may be an FTP or some very simple operation. Now you're getting SOA-based implementations in the smart grid architectures you're getting multiple products in that space that are all having to interface, and you're saying, okay, we're using SOAP. What sort of messaging are you using? Are you using XACML? Are you using SAML? All these different things, in addition to what ports are open and things like that, and the vendors are saying, well, we can't possibly expose what's available. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense anymore. We're used to an enterprise environment where APIs are exposed, there's toolkits, there's other things like that. That doesn't work on a lot of different levels, not just security, but interoperability. And that's going to be the next question when these utilities, and you have a Monarch system or something else like that. It says, I need to integrate with my outage management system. I need to integrate with my distribution management system. And you go to the other OSI and say, tell me how to do that. I need to work with that. Give me the APIs you're exposing so I can work that. And I think you're going to get some of the same answers, $150,000 or whatever the number is, because they were designed in eras where, it was freestanding. And in fact, as Mike was saying, at companies like Emerson, they bundle all their other stuff together, the security center with, the Symantec and CoreTrace and all these other things, because they don't want to have to deal with customers saying, I got this other package here that I want to integrate with you guys. Well, that's going to happen, and they have to have a solution. So you get it one way or the other, whether it's from NERC or from customers that actually want to, be more efficient and automated.
I want to move on. I'm actually way past my time, but take another 5 minutes.
Start a little late too,
Okay.
so.
Let's take another 5 minutes. Basically, then there's the patch management, security patch management process, not patch management. This only applies to security patches. One good way to do this is to, that I've seen is to, you can subscribe to things like Secunia, which will give you a live vulnerability feed on every vulnerability that could potentially exist in your environment. And they will tell you what the patches are that are associated with those vulnerabilities and which vulnerabilities exist that don't have patches. From that information, you'd want to feed that into your, your control system environment, whoever's got CCAs, and basically make them acknowledge whether or not they're going to apply those patches. That's sort of what this requirement is saying. They don't actually require you to patch it. They require you to evaluate the patch and let them know if you don't patch it, right? So it's a kind of a convoluted way of saying that you need to patch everything. But at the same time, you can't patch a lot of these systems, so that's kind of why they take that approach.
Sorry, what's the maximum amount of time that CIP lets an entity who's determined that a patch is essential to a critical cyber asset, lets that entity schedule the implementation of that patch into the future?
I'd be interested to know that too, because I think it's forever, right?
So that's a great question and very relevant. And Steve, we've talked about this when we were in the regional level on the regional compliance working groups. There's really no specification on the time, but it has to fall within some sort of logical reasoning. And what is that logical reasoning? Well, that's not defined within the standard requirement either. So,
is that auditor interpretation?
Yeah, actually, it kind of is left up to the auditor interpretation. So, is it reasonable to? And I think Steve can talk about this too. If NERC comes up with something separate, obviously that would be followed. But when I was leaving, it was if we're talking about a generation plant where you can't really patch the DCS until you go into a shutdown, then it makes sense to defer implementation until you go to the next shutdown and you can actually shut down your DCS, right? Same thing with an EMS operation system. If you are maybe doing a scheduled failover test to your backup, and you get that up and running, and then you go ahead and shut down the primary, do an upgrade, install your patches, that makes sense. It has to make sense. There's definitely not the idea of infinite. Like that should not, it shouldn't be, we'll get to it when we get to it. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, there should be something in place for compensating against what that patch was going to protect against. So.
And it's a good idea just to have them, if you track it, you'll find that they'll respond to that. You tell them, hey, this patch is available for your system. Tell me when you're going to apply it, or tell me if you're not going to apply it. And if you're not going to apply it, when do you think you might apply it? That sort of thing kind of creates awareness, and it forces the entity or the asset owners to do things. Oh, sorry.
Well, I've heard that there's a patching can that's being worked on at NERC. Can you talk about it at all?
It was in December, as I was wrapping up the last of my projects, I saw the emails going back and forth, but I really don't know what they finally resolved. I saw, basically, it's a compliance audit. What's the N stand for, Jim? A CAN notice? Application notice. So the idea is, okay, yeah. So basically, if you're not familiar with a CAN, it's a way of affecting the standards or of interpreting the standards, kind of like, and having a thing that the auditors would be bound to across the nation. So if this CAN gets approved, I saw 5 or 6 different iterations of it, but basically there's some people saying that 90 days later you got to have it done. Other people were saying that you have to basically put together a project plan and show that it's on your horizon and have a reason to justify why you're putting it off at all. So I don't know what the final details were.